Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to what promises to be an absolutely fascinating session. As many of you will know, this year is the 80th anniversary of the, well, what should we say, contentious, morally murky, insufficiently known episode during which the British government saw fit to intern so-called enemy aliens for fear of a fifth column in 1940. I'm sure most of you know the basic background, and we won't be going into that in any detail. As again, some of you may know if you've been following the Insiders Outsiders project, because of it being the 80th anniversary and because it is such an understudied and important corner, if you like, of British wartime history, and indeed British history, full stop, you might say. We have actually hosted a number of other internment-related events from June during Refugee Week, and then again in the late summer, and indeed in this last batch of online events. And if you're interested, if you didn't actually hear them, if you aren't aware of them, do take a look at the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel, just very easy to find if you do a Google search, and many of them will be, well, in fact, they'll all be on there for you to watch and listen to in your own time. But today, let us focus in on the sort of here and now. It's my very great pleasure to, first of all, introduce our two speakers. Perhaps just to reiterate, if you wouldn't mind making sure that you are both muted and with the video off. I can still see some of your faces. It's not that I don't want to see you, but I think just for the purposes of Zoom, thank you very much. It's probably better. No. Very good. So first of all, Dawn Waterman is going to say a few words about her wonderful project. She's the Archives and Heritage Manager of the Board of Deputies of British Jews and leads, indeed, Dawn, I think it was your idea, am I right? But anyway, tell us more. Leads their new and very exciting online archives project entitled very kind of resonantly Hidden Treasures, Celebrating Jewish Archives in Britain. Second presenter today is speaking from the Isle of Man. We're going to get a wonderfully sort of behind the scenes insider's look at the rich archival resources at Manx National Heritage. Yvonne Cresswell trained as a geographer and a local historian originally, and she's been one of two assistant keepers, later renamed curators, of social history at the Manx Museum, now known as Manx National Heritage, since 1987. She's worked on the social history and costume collections as well as the national art collection. And most pertinently, she's been closely involved, and I can speak from first-hand experience, having had the pleasure of meeting Yvonne on the Isle of Man and listening to her talk. She's an absolute mine of information, absolutely wonderful. She has been working on the topic of internment, civilian internment in both world wars, and maybe this is something we can briefly touch on. It wasn't just during the Second World War that civilians were interned, although our focus today, of course, will be on 1940, since 1989. Very good. Well, thank you very much, both of you, for being here. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Dawn to tell us a little bit about her project.
Sure. So I'll just say a few words about Hidden Treasures. I'm kind of the appetizer before the main course, Yvonne's main course. The Manx Museum is one of the archives featured in the Board of Deputies Hidden Treasures. And Hidden Treasures, celebrating Jewish archives in Britain, is the kind of online project which showcases and celebrates those archives in this country that tell the story of Jews in Britain. I put the details in the chat so you'll be able to see them. The archives tell the stories of Jews through artifacts, photos, oral histories, documents, videos. The earliest items in our Hidden Treasures collections are from the 11th century, and the most recent was dated yesterday. So we've got over 40 archives in participating in Hidden Treasures. So far, new archives are joining us all the time. We've got national and local archives, university special collections, and specifically Jewish archives. Some are big, some are small, some are general, some are specific. And they're from England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, but they all tell in some way the stories of Jews in this country. I was thinking about internment, of course, because that's our subject tonight. And I came up with 5 archives involved with Hidden Treasures that tell the story of internment. There's the Association of Jewish Refugees, Refugee Voices. One of the interviewees there is Klaus Hinrichsen, who we're going to hear, I'm quite sure, a lot more about this evening. There's the Tate Britain They have Henrikson's archive, actually, and at the moment they've got an exhibition about their archives. I mean, I went to see it last week. Of course, it's closed from tomorrow, but hopefully it will reopen. And in that exhibition, there's a bit about Henrikson's time in the Hutchinson camp, which we'll probably hear more about. There's the Wiener Holocaust Library, of course, who have a wealth of material. The Imperial War Museum, who have interviews with internees. And of course, the government's National Archives at Kew. They have alien index cards, Home Office files, and most excitingly, the MI5 files about internees who were being observed. In our online project, we're promoting treasures from these archives on social media. If you have a look at See the Treasures, our most recent treasure is a terrific portrait, somewhat idealized, he called it, of a portrait of Klaus Henriksson from Refugee Voices, painted by the German artist Kurt Schwitters, when they were both interned in the
wishing you a long life. It sounds like
on the Isle of Man.
Sorry, can I just interrupt there? There's somebody who obviously doesn't realise they're not.
Yeah.
Can everybody please, and I mean everybody, can please make sure that you are muted. I also forgot to say that you probably all know this already, but if you, somebody called Hazel Summerfield, I'm afraid you are.
Oh dear, poor you.
Hazel, I'm sorry, could you please mute yourself?
It's just people are going down like 19. Pat's husband died.
Hazel Summerfield,
yeah,
please mute yourself.
Because he's got COVID, and they wouldn't let her see him. I mean, how ridiculous is that if somebody's dying anyway?
Right. Let me see if
she's
I can
really upset. And then one of my cousins, actually, she's the first in my generation that's died.
Wait a second.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm afraid we are the mortal generation now.
Right, I think I've done the job.
You think you've done it?
Well, hold on, have I? Should have.
I think you have.
Yes, okay.
Okay, so it got as far as the portrait of Klaus Henriksson by Kurt Schwitters. And that, in fact, that brings me very neatly onto Yvonne. So I hope I've kind of whetted your appetite for the main course, for the feast, actually, which will be, I'm quite sure, will be Yvonne's presentation. All about living with the wire, internment on the Isle of Man. Over to you, Yvonne.
Thank you, Dawn.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Dawn. So I will now start the presentation.
Perfect.
So basically, I'll be talking about the different types of collections relating to internment that we have at Manx National Heritage. And right, just one moment. Basically, to say that when I first came to Manx Museum in 1987, I knew nothing about internment. And although the Manx Museum had large collections relating to internment, they hadn't had an exhibition about internment. But in 1990, Dr. Klaus Henriksson contacted Manx National Heritage and suggested having an exhibition. And originally it should have been in about 1990, 1991, the exhibition, but it was realized that there was so much material and it was such an important topic that instead of just spending maybe a year or two researching it, instead I actually ended up researching it for the next 4 years. And the result of that was the Living with the Wire exhibition and the accompanying book. And what was fascinating was that when we did Living with the Wire, the attitude was that internment could easily have become a lost footnote in history, but it was felt important that it needed to be brought out into the open and for more people to know about it. And I am greatly sort of indebted to Dr. Henriksen for introducing me to so many fellow ex-internees, who in turn introduced me to more ex-internees. And it was the generosity of all the people who I met in the early 90s that actually brought about that exhibition, Living with the Wire, which I very much did for the ex-internees. I wanted them to feel that their memories and their experiences had actually been sort of validated and brought into the public arena. So at the time we did the exhibition, we did the book, and we thought that then interest would wane. What surprised both myself and my fellow colleague Alan Franklin, who was the librarian at the time at Manx National Heritage, was the fact that that interest didn't go away. So after we'd had the exhibition, we had increasing numbers of letters and inquiries from ex-internees, then from the families of ex-internees, from academic researchers. Then there was a lot of interest from the media in terms of TV and radio interviews, both on the island and from British media. So programs such as Coast, when they came to the Isle of Man, Second World War internment was one of the topics that they looked at. Alan Franklin, as I say, the librarian, he did a lot of work with the AJR and produced articles for them, just so that people knew what we had in our library and archives. And again, it was, we thought, something that might sort of, reduce in interest, but it didn't. It kept on growing. Over the past 30 years, I've done a large number of talks and guided walks, and I've always been fascinated by the fact that you would assume that after a couple of years, anyone who'd wanted to do a guided walk around the camps would have done it. But instead, every year, and for the past 10 or more years with Heritage Open Days, every year, I do walks around the various internment camps, the sites of the internment camps on the island, and they're always fully booked. There's always interest. So what's fascinating is the interest keeps on growing all the time. And over the time, we've had things like in 2005, the Isle of Man Arts Council basically sponsored a community arts project and a promenade theatre event in Port Erin. And it was a presentation of life in the Russian internment camp, which you'll hear more about later tonight. And it was truly a community arts event. And the person who put it together, Peggy Riley, interviewed and talked with a lot of ex-internees about their experiences in Port Erin and Port St Mary. And then she worked with local people in the community. And this went from actually young children through to older adults, and really brought everybody together. And for me personally, one of the most poignant parts was at the very end when there was a large bonfire on the beach. And the young children, the young teenage girls that we had been following their story in this sort of promenade theatre event, stood alongside the ex-internees whose story they've been telling. So you saw these older ladies with these young teenage girls who had been telling their stories. And I think it was a very sort of important community event in sort of bringing to a younger generation the story of internment. Then in 2010, we had internment art exhibitions. We had Forced Journeys exhibition at the Sale Gallery. The Isle of Man Post Office did a stamp issue of internment art. And this interest just keeps on growing. So the Living with the Wire book, which we had first published in 1994 and kept reprinting because it kept selling out. So every time we had a print run, it would sell out after a few years. And then in 2010, we republished it in full colour. So it's now in its second edition. And I suspect will get revised again because there's always more information. The Russian Heritage Trust, as I say, you'll be hearing more from them later. They did an exhibition, Friend or Foe, about Russian camp and published a book. As I say, Alan Franklin, who'd been the librarian at the museum and had basically brought together so much of the internment collections in the library, published a book, Involuntary Guess, which brought together all the sources and is very much a book where everything you'd need to know about what sources are available can be found in Involuntary Guess. So as I say, the interest kept growing. But to talk about what we have at Manx National Heritage, starting in the library and archives at the Manx Museum, collecting interment is not actually a new subject for the Manx Museum. In the 1920s, they were collecting World War I internment material. They collected ephemera. They collected the camp newspapers. So it was very much contemporary collecting from the beginning. Equally well in the 1940s and 1950s, the Manx Museum Library and Archives were collecting material on Second World War internment. Now, we often think that the idea of contemporary collecting is a very modern thing for libraries and archives and museums, but I'm fascinated that my predecessors were actually doing this at the time. So whereas other parts of the British Isles may have forgotten and consciously forgotten internment, on the Isle of Man, the Manx Museum had decided that they were going to collect internment in both World Wars. So as I say, we were very much sort of building on very strong foundations. So in our library, we have a large collection of books about internment, from books that were published in the 1940s through to sort of current research. And it was seen as being important that this wouldn't be just a few books on internment, but that we would actually try to provide as many of the publications as possible. So anyone coming to the island, as part of their research, can look at all the various books that have been produced on the subject of internment, because in both World Wars, First and Second World War, anybody who was interned, the likelihood was that they will have spent at least part of their internment experience on the Isle of Man. So anything that's written about internment will at some point touch on experiences in the Manx camps. And as I say, with the library collections, it's not just books. We have the camp newspapers. So we have basically runs of the Onchan Pioneer camp newspaper, Sefton Review, Hutchinson Camps, The Camp. But there's also been a sort of a desire that any pieces of ephemera, and not just from the period of internment during the early 1940s, but anything subsequently is collected. And if we're not able to acquire an original, a photocopy. So we have all sorts of material. And I do wonder whether there might be some pieces where we may have the only surviving example. So as I say, there's been this sort of ongoing desire to have a growing archive and library collection. We also have the Manx newspapers, which are all now digitized, which go from the 1790s, and we're in the process of actually sort of digitizing from the 1960s onwards. But from 1790s to 1960, you can actually search online all the Manx newspapers, but this means that you can actually search and read the island's own response to internment. So you can actually search and go through all the Manx newspapers for the period of internment. And there's a lot of information in the Manx papers about internment, whether that's the houses being requisitioned to make the camps, the views of various newspapers about internees, in some cases maybe court cases involving internees, but then about the release of the internees. So you can actually get sort of the Manx perspective from the newspapers as well. There's also photographs. Now, given we have very few photographs relating to internment in the Second World War, apart from the ones which are held at Tate Britain of Hutchinson Camp, there's very few photos for the other camps. But in the Manx newspapers, you'll find press photographs of internees coming off the boat, in particular the female internees. In the archives, we also have large collections of letters from internees, the contemporary correspondence, often from one interned person to maybe their interned spouse. So letters from a male internee in Onken camp to his wife who's in Russian internment camp. But as well as having this wealth of first-hand sort of commentary and testimony from the internees during internment, we also have a large amount of correspondence from ex-internees, which were gathered actually as part of the Living with the Wire project. And here we've got I've got copies of letters from Herbert Caden, who was interned in Peveril Camp. And when he wrote to me with his memories of being in Peveril Camp, he put little sort of thumbnail sketches, little pen and ink sketches of his memories of being in Peveril Camp. So you have this combination of the testimony from the time, but also people's reflections decades later about their internment experience. We also have various plans of the camps, and in, let's say, the case of Hutchinson, we have the official plan, which is the coloured one on the left, and then the internees' own annotated plan on the right. At the Isle of Man Public Record Office, there was also another set of official plans for all of the camps. And in this particular image here, that's actually a photocopy of one of the official PRO, the Crown Copyright plans, which a ex-internee had annotated from memory where he thought all of the activities were taking place within the camp. So as I say, it's not just material from the period of internment, 1940-41, but it's also the sort of subsequent material that's been collected and developed up until, sort of very recently. I've got a picture here of one of the sort of, in a sense, camp censuses, one of the statistical accounts, where they're actually listing sort of the numbers of the internees and sort of trying to categorize them by age, marital status and everything. So there's a vast amount of material. Sadly, you never find everything for every camp. But it's like a jigsaw. I've always said it's like a jigsaw puzzle, where at the beginning, when I started doing Living with the Wire, it didn't feel at times that we had many jigsaw puzzle pieces, but as time goes on, new pieces of the jigsaw puzzle are always appearing, and information, ephemera, material, which in itself doesn't seem very important, can actually be really important when you suddenly realise how it fits with something else. In the archives, there's also, together with these sort of collections of letters, you might find there's postcards, artwork, cartoons. So we have deposits which are basically the sort of the paper documentation of, for various people, their internment experience in terms of letters, ephemera, all of the associated sort of paperwork. In some cases, families have deposited the originals with us, and in others, they've deposited copies. But it still means that in different ways, they're providing, to say, different parts of the jigsaw puzzle. Sadly, there's only a limited number of photographs. The photography was basically banned. So a lot of these photographs, one does have to question how and when they were taken. The only sort of, in a sense, comprehensive photographic survey was done under the auspices of Captain Daniel, who was the camp commandant at Hutchinson Camp. And he basically got a camera and film and got one of the internees, who was a photographer, to basically photographically document the camp. In contrast, the other camps are very much the sort of a handful of group photos of individual internees. We also have alien registration cards. Having been sort of registered as an enemy alien, having gone through the tribunal, but then having been interned, you know, sort of following the fall of France and the Netherlands, and the fear of fifth columnists, and the view that there was going to be mass internment. Originally, there would have been alien registration cards with a photograph and all the details for every internee. Sadly, the male cards were destroyed, and so all that's actually now survived are cards for the female internees. But at least it does mean that for most of the female internees held in Russian internment camp, there are existing registration cards. Sadly, they don't survive for the men. Over the past sort of 20, 30 years, my colleague, as I say, Alan Franklin, who's a librarian, one of the things that he did, because of the number of inquiries, was to ask people if they would fill in a questionnaire to sort of gather information. And so again, it was another way of sort of documenting and basically sort of, rather than just having, in a sense, the sort of the raw data, to bring it down to the sort of the personal stories. I think it can be said that there isn't a single internment experience. For every internee, it's a very different experience. And having met so many ex-internees, that's what brought me to that sort of view. And then with gathering information with the questionnaires and the correspondence, that again brought it home that for every internee, it was a very different experience. Some said it was probably the best time of their life. They made lifelong friends. For others, it was hell. For the majority, I think it was like Charles Dickens says, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. But for every internee, it was a personal experience. So I think we've always felt it was important to collect the individual's memories, because each one is providing a different facet and a different impression of what internment could and would be like for different people. We've been compiling an internee database. We've had a volunteer who has gone through the various books and various material in the library and in the archives, also going through the surviving alien registration cards. And we've created a database which gives name, forename, if known, date of arrival, address, any information and where that information has been found. For the male internees, it's very hit and miss. It will never be a complete list because we don't have the alien registration cards, but it at least provides some information. And what happens is that when people contact Manx National Heritage, sometimes they'll ask about a family member and we have no information at all. And they're the first people to provide information about a relative who was interned on the island. For other people, we can actually say, well, we've found all of this information from all these different sources. So if someone's looking for a female internee, as I say, there will be an alien registration card and there will be information on the database. It's far more, sort of, say, hit and miss with the male internees. We also have a large collection of art by a variety of different artists. And it's interesting how different artists responded to being interned in quite different ways and represented and illustrated camp life in quite different ways. Sometimes people were producing portraits of fellow internees. Some were actually documenting the camp around them, with or without the wire. And the wire was not always the most important or sort of the most heavily featured part of any artwork. We also have a large collection of craft work, predominantly from the female camp, from the Russian camp. Interestingly, the male internees in the men's camp, the main things that survive are the camp newspapers and a lot of artwork. In terms of craft work, there's very little except ships and bottles by the Italian internees. But in terms of the objects we have a large number of items made in the Russian internment camp. And I love the fact that a lot of them are to almost sort of give you a sense of there may be a war on, but it's no reason why you shouldn't look good and feel good. I suspect that the woolen gloves that you can see here are very important so that you don't get chilblains in the middle of a cold Manx winter. But then there's lots of these very delicate crocheted gloves, and it's almost as though if you have a set of different coloured gloves, it's almost as though you can change the look of your outfit just by changing your gloves. And people would also crochet collars as well. And anybody could actually have something, whether it was collecting shells off the beach to make a shell necklace, or scavenging small pieces of wood to then hand paint to make buttons. Anything could be made, and then with things like the service exchange, these could then be exchanged for other things. Equally well, you might give them as presents, or you might be sort of bartering or selling them to the local Manx population as well. And a lot of people in the Russian camp actually did get things from the internees. Again, it could be all sorts of different things. Here there's a ship model made by an Italian internee, but the carved wooden block was actually made for the doctor in the Russian camp, the women's camp, and it was carved by one of the female internees as a thank you present and a mark of their appreciation for the camp doctor. We've had exhibitions about internment since 1989. We've had them in the art gallery, and every time the art gallery changes, there's new work on display. But the idea of displaying the art of war or living with the wire has been an integral part of the National Art Gallery since it first opened in '89. Equally well, in the permanent exhibitions, we've had the Social History Gallery, when it opened in 1991, had a tourist hotel bedroom, And on one side, it had peace, and it was Happy Holidays, summer 1939. And it was decorated as though it was occupied by a young female tourist. But then on the opposite side of the bedroom, you have war, and it's summer 1940. And it's how in 12 months, one hotel bedroom has completely changed from being somewhere where a mill girl from Lancashire is staying on holiday to being somewhere where an enemy alien has been interned. And I always think the fear people must have felt in the summer of 1940 when they find themselves on the Isle of Man behind barbed wire. And at that point, they're not talking about if there's going to be an invasion, it's potentially when is there going to be an invasion. And all these people who, either because they're Jewish or political refugees from Nazi Germany, have now found themselves quite literally living with wire on the Isle of Man with no idea what's going to happen. That display was replaced in 2018, and as part of the new military gallery, we have now a new Second World War internment display, and have the opportunity to display a lot more of the internee craft work that was produced in the camps. Something which I think is quite easy to forget is when coming to the Isle of Man, it's also the opportunity to discover a sense of place and actually visit the camps themselves. Because for the most part, most of the camps, when you walk along Douglas Promenade or when you walk around Hutchinson Square, you are basically walking in the footsteps of those who were interned in the summer of 1940. And you can see the same boarding houses and hotels where they stayed. And I know on various occasions I've said to people about how I thought it was important that they visit the Isle of Man, and particularly people who'd been working on Hutchinson Square, and they said they only actually fully appreciated the artwork and understood the representations of Hutchinson Square when they had physically stood in the square itself, because the artwork was amazing, but it gave them no sense of the scale. So to actually sort of get that sense of place is still possible when visiting the island and seeing the camps. So where to find out more? The Manx newspapers are available for free on the iMuseum, and they are fully searchable, and you can search them by both keywords or by date. So you can read a whole newspaper from a particular day in June 1940 and sort of see what was happening at the same time that internees were arriving on the island. Equally well, you can search to see if a particular person was mentioned in the papers, or if you're wanting information about a particular camp, you can search by that as well. The alien registration cards, sadly, as I said, we don't have the male cards anymore, but we do have the female cards. And again, you can go on the iMuseum, which is basically the digital Manx National Heritage collections. And by searching under people and Second World War internees, you can find the information which is on the alien registration cards. We also have available a bibliography of the main primary and secondary sources, but I should stress they're only the main sources. The full collection is far larger, but the bibliography which is available on the Manx National Heritage website provides sort of an indication of the main sources, but there is far more in the collections. So any questions? And to provide the sort of the contact, it's library@mnh.in.
Wonderful. Very much, Yvonne. Gosh, lots of rich resources to think about and hopefully for people to take advantage of. Now, I don't want to hold the conversation at all. And I think that for starters, Dawn had some things she wanted to sort of bring up for you, and there have been a number of questions which I will field in due course. But Dawn, do you want to just sort of set the ball rolling?
Sure. Well, if I can, it's kind of, in fact, I've got my copy of Living with Wires, which I was reading in the sunshine today over lunch. I'll tell you one question I did have. I went, as I said, to the Take Britain exhibition about their archives, and in it, under 1940, they've got, I think there are 2 black and white photos from Hutchinson Camp, and there's a newspaper article. But there's also a permit to visit, and I wanted to know a bit more about the permit to visit. I've got no idea what that might be.
Basically, unless you were a military guard or part of the military, you would need a permit to enter the internment camp. So whether that was Manx civilian workers, they would need permits to get in and out of the camps, but also for people who were coming to the island to visit people who were interned. And it's interesting that some of those are actually the court cases, because there were problems where people had come over to the island to visit somebody, and let's say they thought they had all the paperwork they required, but they didn't. Because once you reach the island, you would have to report to the police station. They would check your paperwork. And there were various cases of people who were visiting the island to visit interned, let's say, husbands, fiancés. But there were a few cases where people, having gone to the camp to visit somebody, and they were quite short visits, then proceeded to miss the bus back. And then that meant that they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I think there was one case, if my memory isn't sort of deceiving me, where I'm sure the problem was she'd missed the bus a couple of times because she was cutting it so fine with leaving the camp. And I think it was just basically that she hadn't reckoned on how quickly or how slowly she could run to the bus stop. And so, again, it's these things where the newspapers are fascinating for providing all of that sort of fine detail about sort of, as you say, you can see a permit, but then to sort of read in a newspaper account of a court case about what happens when you're trying to actually squeeze every last minute out of a visit. And I think probably on one case, the bus went early and then she's in the wrong place. So yes.
Fantastic. I mean, I know that the minute we're allowed to, I'm going to come up to the Isle of Man and have a look. Monica, it looks to me like there are quite a few questions.
Absolutely.
So
maybe yes.
Give someone else a chance.
With great pleasure. I'll certainly just perhaps say, absolutely second that. I had read about internment, I was fascinated by it, but coming last October, Yvonne absolutely transformed my whole perception and deepened my understanding of the whole episode. So yes, absolutely, a visit is imperative. And perhaps actually, just while I think about it, before we come to other people's questions, I will mention that there were plans in the pipeline pre-COVID that the AJR, in fact, still does have a plan to put a blue plaque up on the Isle of Man to commemorate the experience. And I was also hatching plans in discussion with Jewish Renaissance magazine with a view to actually organising a guided tour with Yvonne, no doubt, roped in to give guided walks and other people besides, which would have been this summer, but of course events intervened. But keep an eye on the Insiders Outsiders website, because we're hoping that maybe we can revive the idea for next summer. So anyway, right, let's have a look at the questions. Hold on a second. All right, what's happening here? Hold on. Okay, they're coming in thick and fast. Perhaps I'll just go through them more or less as they came in. Yes, from Charlotte. My father and uncle were interned as enemy aliens in Onken camp. I was in Douglas a few years ago and put in a request for information about them, but there was nothing available. Is it worth my putting in another request just in case something has been found since? I think I know what it is.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I would always suggest getting back in contact maybe every 3 or more years, because just because at one point there wasn't anything doesn't mean to say that a few years later something hasn't appeared. And one example of that is the fact that for years there were no lists known for the internment camps. And about 20 years ago, we got a phone call from somebody on the South Coast to say they'd been in a bookshop, some antiquarian bookshop, and they'd found this hardback, very thin sort of book, and it was a nominal roll for the one of the internment camps, and it listed all of the Italian internees in that particular camp at a particular date. And that had just been sort of sitting somewhere. But thankfully, somebody recognized its significance and contacted us. So it does show that material is constantly coming to the surface, and just because nothing was found 5 years ago, 10 years ago, doesn't mean to say there isn't anything now.
No, indeed. Perhaps I can just come in there also, as you mentioned, the Italians. I think it is, with respect, Dawn, to your wonderful project, important to remember that it wasn't obviously by force of circumstance. Most of the internees were Jewish refugees, Nazis, but of course there were the Italians and also the non-Jews, the anti-fascists, the communists. Some of the communists, of course, were Jewish. Also, we mustn't forget that. So I think, we need to be aware of the wider circumstances.
No, of course.
I'm sure you'd agree. Right. Yes. Again, from Charlotte, actually, my father hardly ever mentioned his experience, and that's an important point, I think, isn't it? But he did say that he and his brother were very well looked after. My uncle went into Onken camp suffering ill health and was cared for and recovered. And there was another question, and I'm sorry, I don't have the name of the person to hand, who was actually asking about the medical records, whether indeed they still exist.
It would be worth checking. I think that there may be some records, because what's interesting is that every camp actually had its own hospital. So they had their own medical facilities. So, as I say, every camp had a few houses which were designated as the hospital. You equally well had the Falkencliffe, which was a hotel up on the cliffs that was designated as an internee hospital. If necessary, internees could also go to Noble's Hospital, which was the main Manx hospital. I was going to say that in Central Camp, they had about 200 consultants who had been training and gaining extra qualifications in the London training hospitals, and they were interned en masse, moved through the system en masse, and ended up at Central together. So I've always sort of said that the Manx doctor who was responsible for Central Camp had 200 of the best second opinions you could possibly get. So if you were going to be ill, Central Camp was the place to be. Interestingly, Onken Camp, I would say, although it's one that's not, it doesn't have the prestige of Hutchinson, because Hutchinson had Kurt Schwitters, and it also had Dr. Klaus Henriksen, who then did so much work subsequently on internment. But Onken Camp was probably the best camp to be in the sense that it had the most free area. It had what amounted to its own sort of small farm, small holding, with poultry and all sorts of livestock. They had vegetable plots. They had a football pitch. So they actually had quite a lot of sort of open space, and it was just over the 1,000 internees, because some of the promenade camps had 3,000 people in a terrace of about 28 hotels with very little free space. So some were in a sense very overcrowded, but Onken actually did have a lot more space around it.
And it's also perhaps worth mentioning, Yvonne, that Jack Bilbo was very much the kind of cultural impresario there, and there was in fact a very lively cultural life in Onken as well.
Well, what fascinates me is that Onken Camp is probably the best documented because it has the Onken Pioneer newspaper. So you have so much information in the newspapers about camp life, and it had as many artists, it had art exhibitions, but I think you could say it didn't have Kurt Schwitters. So Hutchinson is always going to be the one that people therefore know about. But a lot of the things that people talk about in Hutchinson, the Camp University and the education. You also had at Onken Camp as well.
And somebody, Yvonne has quite rightly pointed out, that Onken had the 3 members of the Amadeus Quartet.
Yes, exactly.
Claim to fame, indeed. On the question of Schwitters, there have been a number of comments and observations coming in. I mean, clearly he is an internationally renowned figure in the art world, but I think there's a danger of him, in a sense, as you say, overshadowing many of the other fascinating creative individuals. But having said that, there's yes, Vicky Guidala asking about Schwitters, and Rose, let me just get this right, Rose Clark pointing out, for those who don't know, after internment, Schwitters came to live near Ambleside in the Lake District, and some of his later work is held in the Armitt Museum in Ambleside, and also at the Abbott Hall Museum in Kendal, and also, of course, the Hatton Gallery in Newcastle. And Gwendolyn Webster, who was the one who asked about the medical records, by the way, said, yes, if anybody speaks German, there's a semi-fictional and really interesting account of Hutchinson Camp, which includes a mention of Schwitters by Richard Friedenthal, which in English is called World in a Nutshell. I think, yes, I don't think it's been translated yet, has it? But also in Gwendolyn's own biography of Schwitters, there's a chapter on his time in the Isle of Man. And there was also, of course, the Tate exhibition not very long ago, with Schwitters in England, which is a useful resource. Right, there are all sorts of others. Let's just keep on scrolling down and having a look. Sorry, my cursor is freezing here. Yes, when are the open days? A very practical question. When are the open days that you were referring to, Yvonne?
What happens is that at the beginning of October every year, we have what's called the Heritage Open Days. So similar to in London where they have the Heritage Open Days. And it's the 2 weekends at the beginning of October. And for about the past 10, 12 years, I usually do walks around the different internment camps. And this year, because we had no idea what was going to happen with COVID, whether we were going to have to social distance, and for a variety of reasons, I thought, well, what I'll do is put together a PowerPoint on each of the sets of camps, and also do a guided walk leaflet, which is then going to, has basically been trialed with the people who attended the lectures. And the idea is that any obvious mistakes or any improvements, of which I'm sure there will be many, that can and should be made, we'll be doing over the next few months. So that the idea is that for the future, there will be a set of guided walk leaflets that anyone coming to the island can then do a self-guided tour. So it's something I've wanted to do for quite a while, but with COVID, I sort of thought, well, actually, because we don't know whether we'll be able to take groups out or not, now is the opportunity to do it. So.
Yes, it's been a blessing in disguise that we've been forced to rethink about some of the ways we communicate. Yes, indeed. Now, I was shocked, if I can just sort of inject a personal note, I was actually rather shocked and disconcerted when I did come to the Isle of Man last October, that there were so few markers beyond the museum itself of this extraordinary history. And actually, apropos that, I have a question, Yvonne, if I may. You mentioned quite rightly that, you know, what your resources enable us to do is to see the Manx perspective on the whole episode. And I just wonder, you know, you obviously are utterly committed to the history and making it known. Do you feel there's, if I can put it tactfully, you know, is there sufficient interest, would you say, among the local Manx population at the present in this history?
I would say yes, there is, because I know I get teased that when we do the Heritage Open Days, the comment is that the guided walks are some of the first ones to reach their limit. And I keep sort of thinking, but surely by now everyone who wants to have done one of these guided walks has done it. But no, every year there's more interest. And and this is literally going back to the 1990s, when going to talk to anything from WIs to Rotary to whatever types of groups, First and Second World War internment is always the most popular talk. That, you know, they almost go down the list, but the top ones they want to hear are the internment ones. And I've had it where I've gone back to a group however many years later, and they sort of said, oh, we've got a lot of new members, they've not heard you talk about internment, so we'd like you to talk about internment. And it's something that we do with the schools as well. We have sessions working on Ireland at War, and internment is always one of the aspects that is done as part of that. And I almost put in the PowerPoint a thank you card I got from one of the local schools, because I did a series of my guided walks of Hutchinson Camp for 9 and 10-year-olds. And they were absolutely fascinated. And so I would say that the interest is changing, because when I was first involved, back in about 1990, so many people remembered the Second World War internment, and they had first-hand memories of the internment camps, whereas now it's much more people know of the internment camps through what their parents and other people have told them. So I would say actually that it is something that there is a lot of interest on the island.
So you're saying that most of the majority of people who go on your walks, for example, are locals. I'm just curious to know how many visitors come from elsewhere.
What's interesting is that, because I also do the walks sort of during the year as well, and it's often a mixture. Sometimes it's people who know the walks and whatever are taking place, so they've decided to come to the island, but to come at the same time as the guided walks. Otherwise, the vast majority probably are local people.
Right, back to the questions. I have a nice one here from Ingrid Rockberger. So pleased I found out about this event at the last minute. Such useful information for genealogists. I'm writing from Israel, or listening in from Israel, where I'm involved in the Israel Genealogy Research Association, and would love to add this to our resources database. We'll be in touch. And I will say, I'm sure a lot of you will want to be in touch directly with Yvonne. What I would suggest is if you send an email to the Insiders Outsiders contact that's on our website, and then I can forward your messages to Yvonne. I think that's probably the best way to proceed. And let's have a look. Lots of wonderfully complimentary reactions, Yvonne. Yes, a nice question about the stamps. Is the Isle of Man Postal Service producing a set of stamps for the 80th anniversary to complement the great set a few years ago with a picture by Hinrichsen? Question from Robert Drake.
Not that I know of. I mean, what's interesting is that they do different sort of stamps at different times. And actually, it's the sort of thing that if it was suggested to them about doing another issue, yes, they might be very interested, because I know that they're always looking for sort of particular topics and finding different aspects to sort of commemorate or to illustrate. So yes.
And also there's such artistic material, isn't there? I mean, you've just given a kind of small taster. I mean, what fascinates me is the level of cultural activity in the visual arts and of course in other art forms as well. So there'll be plenty of raw material for stamps, indeed. Somebody with a very specific question. I understand that Joseph Pilates was interned on the Isle of Man during the First World War. Is that correct? Yes, I mean, the number of eminent people in the first, but I think probably, am I right, particularly in the Second World War, who made good, who made a real mark in British culture, but also beyond, I think internationally as well, is quite extraordinary.
Yes, I was going to say that in the Second World War, it is, for the most part, we're talking about enemy aliens, or as they called themselves, His Majesty's most loyal enemy aliens. Whereas in the First World War, you had a complete cross-section of people who were living and working in Britain, frequently as economic migrants. So it was a quite different mix. Also in the First World War, people tended to be interned for 4 to 5 years. Whereas in the Second World War, it's much more likely to have been from, let's say, 6 months to 18 months. And for the Second World War internees, they will have seen themselves as wanting to be released to work for the British war effort, for the Allied war effort, which is interesting because they'd only just arrived in Britain, whereas in the First World War, you have people who've been living in Britain for 20, 30 years, are very much assimilated. In many cases, if they're in their 40s or 50s, have sons in the British Army, but actually it's during internment that they rediscover a sense of German or Austrian identity. So I'm always fascinated by how totally different the two types of internment are. In the First World War, it's about nationality and national identity, and then in the Second World War, it's about ideology.
Thank you. A question from Andrea Pack. Apologies if I missed this. I don't think you did, Andrea, but what was the attitude of the locals at the time and how much interaction was there? That's quite a big question and time is rolling on, but a brief answer would be great.
It's completely varied. You had some people both in, and you'll hear about this, about in the Russian camp, where the internees are billeted with the local families. You had some people who wanted nothing to do with internees and very much viewed them as the enemy, to those who, once they got to know internees, actually made friends. So again, it's this thing where there's a complete spectrum, and I think people would find it interesting looking at the Manx newspapers to see how you can probably find most points of view reflected in the different articles. So yeah.
Indeed. Somebody was asking about the newspapers being online. I think you did say that they've all been
Yes.
digitized, haven't they? Yes, indeed. An astute comment here from Rose Clark. I think the children and grandchildren of ex-internees are interested and perhaps feel able to talk openly about their family history in a way that wasn't possible when the internees themselves were still alive. Yes.
One of the things which is why I feel it's such a great privilege is that when I was meeting people in the early 90s, it was a number of people who said to me, and this is the children and grandchildren, you do know that my father has talked to you and told you things that he's never told us. And I do feel that 1989 was a pivotal moment. It's when Klaus Henriksson and a lot of people suddenly realized with the anniversary of the start of the war that if they didn't start talking about their internment memories and their internment experiences, all of it was going to be lost. Now, I understand why when they were released from the internment camps, both physically and I think metaphorically, everything was packed into a little suitcase and it was put in the attic, and they didn't want to think about it because they wanted to be part of the British war effort. They were then creating lives for themselves in post-war Britain. But there does seem to have been this realization by the late 80s of, oh good grief, this could all be lost and nobody will know what happened. And then people started talking about it. And I know when we did the exhibition in '94, a lot of the ex-internees who I had been involved with came to the island for the opening, but it was the first time they'd been back on the island since the day they got on the boat when they were released from whichever camp they were in. And I think a lot of them said, I'm glad I came, because it did feel like it was, in a sense, exorcising the ghosts, that it was laying that past to rest, and that they felt that, no, that it isn't going to be forgotten. And in a sense, it was that passing on of the memories and ensuring that they weren't going to be lost and forgotten, and that it wasn't going to become a lost footnote.
And again from Rose Clark, are you collecting data from ex-internees' families to add to your database?
Oh yes, so if people want to get in contact, then yes. Yeah, we're very much sort of interested in sort of collecting sort of, you know, both material, memories, information. As I say, it's always felt like a jigsaw puzzle, but it's a jigsaw puzzle where you don't have the picture on top of the box, and half the pieces feel like they're missing. But very slowly, all the pieces are coming together.
Wonderful. There's much more we could say, and apologies if I have overlooked or not had time for all the questions. Actually, hold on, let me just, there's some mention here. Yes, here we are from, yes, my husband's paternal grandparents were interned at Onken, Ernst Urbach and Russian Greta Urbach. The wife was allowed to visit her husband once a month, but had to pay her train fare on the Isle of Man Railway and then walk from the station to Onken. The great fear was being taken to Australia, but after the sinking of the ship, that stopped. That's not really a question, but a sort of nugget of memory. From Helen Singer, an observation that I found records from my grandfather and father-in-law at the National Archive in Kew, which of course is another important resource. In fact, actually, Dawn, I don't know whether you have been in touch with them, but that might be worth thinking about. And then I think maybe just to round off, I'm just trying to find the reference. Where's it gone? Yes, here we are. Fran Lloyd. Let's end with this one here, again for Yvonne. A brilliant talk. What would you say, Yvonne, was the most exciting artifact and document that you found during your many years of researching this area?
That is really difficult. I would say the most moving moment, and it's the one that will always live with me, was sitting in somebody's front room and they were telling me about what happened to them in terms of coming to Britain, but also what had happened to family who'd not been able to get out. They were in the process of leaving Germany when war was declared. And I still remember that in that moment, Internment, the Second World War, ceased to be a page in a book, but it was a living experience that I felt so honoured that somebody had shared with me, and to realise how much it was a daily lived experience of what had happened during the war and subsequently. And as I say, that was the moment when it ceased to be, as I say, just a page in a history book. But it very much, it was that sharing. And for all of the ex-internees that I met, the privilege of them sharing their memories with me. Yes.
I think that brings up another important point that we haven't actually brought out into the open, and that is however morally, ethically reprehensible or questionable the British government's behaviour, or indeed maybe the behaviour of certain individuals even on the Isle of Man itself might have been, and how, I mean, the Dunera, the Arandora Star, the internees were treated absolutely appallingly, and we shouldn't ever forget that. But there is a danger, isn't there, of, what can I say, I mean, drawing too many parallels between the internment of the aliens in this country and what was going on in Nazi-dominated Europe, and never for a moment should we forget the grim and much more brutal reality of what they escaped from. So I think that is terribly, terribly important. I think there's just one last comment here. This is going back to more sort of mundane and sort of less emotional things, alongside the many thanks from, is it Sian Quayle? Forgive me if I mispronounce that. I met Klaus Hinrichsen in 2007 and presented a paper on his behalf alongside my own at the Tate Britain Conference, Coachfitters in England. Yes, indeed. And that's also a very useful resource, is it not? I also had the pleasure, actually, way back in the 80s when I was working, I was very pleased to see, Yvonne, that you had the catalogue of the German catalogue of art in exile in Great Britain, 1933 to 45, which is a very young fledgling art historian I was involved with. But the exhibition came to the Camden Arts Centre and was really the first project of its kind to come to these shores, I think it's fair to say. And Klaus Hinrichsen actually gave a paper there, much younger, of course, more sprightly, a lovely, lovely man. Very good.
Yes.
I think
that's why I wanted to start at the very beginning by sort of saying that it was Klaus who introduced me to so many people, and he was the person, and it was his enthusiasm that then actually enthused everybody else to sort of, yes, we want to be involved and we want to do this properly.
I can well imagine. Okay, I think it's probably time to call it a day. So I'm just looking again, I'm being distracted by others. Mostly people just saying a very, very warm thank you, both to Dawn. Actually, hold on, let me, how are we doing for time? A few more sort of specific things coming in. Let me just have a quick look. Yes, Marian Adler, where are we? My German Jewish grandfather and uncle were interned on the Isle of Man. Their wives were allowed to remain in London. And as an adult, they would complain about how her life was for them.
Hard.
Sorry, her life was for them in domestic service, while the men folk had a much easier time. Yes, I mean, the whole issue of the refugees as domestics is perhaps something we haven't got time to delve into, but it's certainly part of the bigger story. Yes, sort of, again, many thanks. I've just had a message from David Memel, who represents Davar in Bristol, just egging me on to mention that I am myself giving a talk about art in internment, setting the art produced in the British internment camps in the wider context of other internment situations during the Second World War, which will be online tomorrow evening at 7:30. It is actually in the, yes, it is. It's in the newsletter that's just been sent out yesterday, but do again contact the Insiders Outsiders website for further information if you would like. Very good. Well, it remains for me just to say a very warm thank you both to Dawn and particularly to Yvonne. Really valuable, wonderful, rich presentation. And also just to remind you, those of you who don't know, that there is, that's why I'm keen to stop now to take a breather, at 7:30. There is another talk which ties in absolutely with what we've been dealing with this evening about Russian, about the women internees in the south of the island, with members of the Russian Heritage Trust, giving us again a kind of insider's view of their researches. So I would urge you, if you've got time and energy, do sign up for that as well. And just finally, although this evening marks the end of this particular series of intensive events on the Insiders Outsiders theme, those of you who have signed up to the newsletter will know that there are all sorts of very interesting things in the pipeline, in a slightly more, not random, but sort of organized by other people as well, in store for the rest of the year. And there will, I assure you, be more to come in 2021. So if you haven't yet signed up to the newsletter, please do. And once again, thank you everybody for being here. Thank you, Yvonne. Thank you, Dawn, and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
All the best.